Well, welcome again to Deep Roots, a conversation about theology and ministry brought to you by us here at Oak Hill College. My name is Tim Ward. I'm one of the teaching staff here, and I'm joined today by, on my right,
David Baldwin. I teach cross-cultural mission, and I'm just leaving that post actually and passing that on to Chris Howells and
Jeremy.
Now, Jeremy, welcome. It is a delight to have you here. You are, in fact, a former student of this illustrious college.
Indeed.
From back in the day. So when were you here?
2007 to 2009, and enormously grateful for the time I had studying here.
And now just tell us a little about what you've been doing in the years since leaving college, because that's going to be our focus here on this podcast.
Yeah, sure. So I had the privilege of living in the Kurdistan region of Iraq for 11 years with my family, and I set up a language consultancy there. So I was teaching English. I also had the opportunity to teach Kurdology, which, in case people have misheard me, has not got to do with heart bypass operations.
I thought it was like Kurds and Whey or something.
Nor kidology, which is something else. Okay. Kurdology.
Kurdology.
That's
yes.
the first time I have ever heard that word.
Yeah. So that's studying the history and culture of the Kurds.
Uh-huh.
And that was an amazing privilege to see a kind of rudimentary textbook, but yeah, it was pretty basic, and so I got to really set the syllabus for myself, and always just had to keep a few years ahead of my students as I taught myself the subject, and that was just fascinating. Yeah,
wonderful. What led you to have that particular focus on an interest in Kurdish people?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a much discussed question among Kurdish friends, because some of the reasons why people might end up in Kurdistan would be, okay, maybe they married a Kurd, or they're involved in espionage or the oil industry, politics or military, or serving God. And my wife is British, and I wasn't interested in those other things. I was there serving the Lord Jesus, and glad to explain that it was because he changed my life as a 17-year-old and gave me a world vision that I ended up serving in a fairly 5,000 kilometers away. But I always saw my work as, I wanted to love my neighbor as myself in a holistic way. And so some of the things, people looked at sort of social media posts and things that I put out and kind of saw, wow, you're involved in lots of things. And I think that's just, I think that human beings are, relational beings, we're spiritual beings, we're physical beings. So, my latest visit, I was very busy organizing a half marathon around the lake. And it was the first of its kind in Hook. A real pleasure. I made it round in just under 2 hours.
Congratulations.
And I just think it was a really good thing for the city, to encourage people to get out there, enjoy the great outdoors, keep fit, make friends, have some healthy competition. So yeah, lots of those things. But, whether you eat or you drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God, 1 Corinthians. And so that was kind of my approach. Developing a nation's language, increasingly I got more involved in developing Kurdish rather than teaching English. Lots of people teaching English, but not many people thinking the one of the keys to this nation's development is that they develop their own language.
Right, okay. Now we're going to get into some particular questions. Are there any things about Kurdish people and Kurdistan that we're going to need to kind of have as crucial background so that we tune in well to some things we're going to be
one of them is the sad reality that you've already said a controversial word, Tim.
Which is?
Kurdistan.
Okay.
So even here in North London, a lot of people would be very proud of the word Kurdistan, but it is incredibly controversial, sadly. I mean, it's ridiculous, but because a stan is just a region, it's the region of the Kurds, it's a geographical descriptor, but it's become this hugely controversial term. In Iran, they have it's just one of the recognized provinces of Iran. It's called Kurdistan, so that's not really controversial. But for Kurds to say I'm from Kurdistan when they're referring to places in southeastern Turkey is enough to really make Turkish people irate.
Uh-huh.
And yet there shouldn't be a battle over what you call that area. So that's one thing by way of orientation that's important to realize. Some people can get very aggro when you talk about Kurdistan. But another thing, I mean, you should put it out there that Kurds are very shaped by their understanding of history. They see themselves as descendants of the ancient Medes. So Bible readers know about the Medes and the Persians, Darius the Great, for example. And so they actually date year zero, not as the birth of Jesus or the flight of Muhammad, but actually the unification of the Median tribes. And so that's, you always add 700 to the AD date to get what is called the Kurdish date. So that's actually quite important. Many people don't know that, but officially the Kurds have their own calendar, which is a very ethnocentric calendar. And it makes a very interesting topic of conversation. What is the key to understanding history? Is it that the Medes were gathered together and they later became this great kingdom that overthrew Nineveh and overthrew Babylon? I mean, those were two very important historical events, so I'd grant that. But is it really the case that everything turns around the foundation of the Medes as a great kingdom? You can tell that I've got lots to say about this.
So
these are big topics.
So these are people who ethnically trace themselves self-consciously back into periods, events, peoples that we know about from biblical history.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
great. Dave, you
and some of what we're going to talk about a little bit later, we'll tap into some of that history as well. Jerry, I just want to ask you before we dive into that. You obviously you threw your lives as a family into Kurdistan and the Kurdish people, but now you're back for educational reasons for your family. How's that adjustment going, and what part of your ministry can still connect you to Kurdish people?
Well, I mean, just by sort of cycling along the Cowley Road, I meet Kurdish friends.
This is in Oxford, isn't it?
Yeah, in Oxford, yeah. I mean, I read Kurdish news stories and keep in touch with a lot of friends back in Kurdistan. And then we'll talk about Nowruz. Anyone listening to this who has the opportunity to go to a Nowruz party, sort of often the eve of the 21st of March, but it can happen at other times just around that date, is something well worth. You will generally be very warmly welcomed as someone who is interested in and wants to celebrate this spring festival with people. So that's a good thing to
Great.
pitch
Well, we'll dive into Nowruz in just a sec. And your family, how are they adjusting to life in the UK after enjoying the hills of Kurdistan? And
they really miss it, Dave.
Yeah, I bet.
I mean, it's interesting because, as you can imagine, there is this big stream of people wanting to leave Kurdistan and come to El Dorado. I point out that it's not El Dorado. You're just exchanging one set of problems for a different set of problems when you move to the West. And many people regret it, by the way. But yeah, our family, I mean, it's where they call home, and so they really are aching to get back and visit. And they'd love to be able to keep up their Kurdish a bit more, and that's quite difficult to do in the rush of life in the West. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about New Year, because we've had a couple already. We've had the European New Year, 1st of January. Then we've had a Lunar New Year, Chinese New Year. And Nowruz, it's another new year. Tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts across that whole region, because it's not just the Kurds, is it? The Kurdish people, but I think 13 different countries celebrate Nowruz. Tell us a little bit about Nowruz.
Okay, so let's start with the Kurdish flag. Okay, so if you see that there's a flag, there's a sun right in the center of the Kurdish flag. It's got 21, what do you call them? Spikes,
Rays.
21 rays. And that represents the 21st of March. So it's very central to Kurdish identity, the celebration of the spring equinox. Nowruz means new. Roz is day. In Kurdish, they actually say Roj with a J. But it shows its Persian roots. Roz is day in Persian. And it's the most important day for Kurdish people. Typically you'll get out enjoying the spring flowers and dancing and fires and playing some funny kind of games, throwing stones, but nowadays the more modern, things have come in, like volleyball's a great one to play.
It's better than stones, isn't it? I think.
Well, yes, I agree. It's a great game, but there's some of the oldies are the goldies, Dave. I've had a good game of Kelvelani, I think they call it, where you have to throw a little stone at a big stone and knock it over. And I always tend to lose against, no matter how much cricket I've played, they always seem to hit the middle stump when they're throwing stones. So,
and for those like me who always had a height disadvantage when it came to volleyball, I'm with the stone game. I have to say.
Okay, well, let's get out and play some Kelvelani sometime, Tim. Yeah.
So people get out, they go into the mountains, beautiful places, they celebrate in the ways you're describing.
Yeah.
But there's some history and myth behind the whole thing, isn't there?
How long have we got, Dave?
Oh, potted version.
Potted version. Okay. So
you've got the wrong version.
I've got some books here. Now look at this. This is the Persian Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, and it's a very recent translation done for Penguin Classics, and it says quite a bit about the origins of Nowruz there. Now, its roots are Zoroastrian. Okay, so the prophet Zoroaster. It's called Zerdeshti in Kurdish, and it's a festival. But Zoroastrians are sometimes referred to as fire worshippers. They generally don't like that term, but fire is very important, very sacred in Zoroastrianism, and therefore fires are very important in the ceremonies. You have people walking with the lanterns up the mountain, particularly Akre in Iraqi Kurdistan, where Michael Palin went on his travels, and he wrote.
I don't think he graduated from here, did he, Michael Palin? I don't think so. But
No,
anyway,
Monty Python's Flying Circus, I don't think graced this academy. Yeah. But it's quite amusing to watch Michael Palin going up the mountain with all of these Nowruz celebrants. But it does mean slightly different things to different people. Many of the people who celebrate Nowruz are very upright Muslims, and they would probably downplay the Zoroastrian elements to it. I'm going to say that as a Christian, I'm happy celebrating Nowruz, though I'm not Zoroastrian.
Oh, we're going to come back to that.
That's an important issue, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us the Kurdish version then of the narrative?
So the folklore that's told in this epic poem. So Ferdowsi, roughly the time of the Norman conquest, if you sort of 11th century kind of time, if I remember rightly, and his Persian Book of Kings is longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey put together, and it's written in poetry, in verse, and he was an amazing poet and teller of this sort of epic story of the kings of Persia, and it's about the evil tyrant Zahak, who had snakes growing out of his shoulders, and he oppressed the people of Persia, and they cried out for liberation, and along came the noble blacksmith, Kawa Asenger, as he's known in Kurdish, and he managed to rally people to protest against the tyrant. Now, can you imagine that motif is quite significant? It has been in Persia, in Iran, in the last couple of years. They can just lift from the ancient legend into contemporary grievances and protests.
So this kind of ancient legend is, you're saying, very much live.
Yeah,
in the stories and imaginations of Kurdish and Persian people right now,
hugely,
including many of whom will be, of course, here in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in North London, you have a lot of Iranians around Finchley, and then loads of Kurds in Enfield, Edmonton area, mainly Kurds from Turkey, for whom Nowruz may be a big thing. I mean, they usually have a big concert down sort of Finsbury Park, somewhere around there. Now, there is a sort of clash this year with Ramadan, actually. Nowruz happening during Ramadan, which can create a bit of a test of loyalty for Kurds. Do they say, look, we'll just boot Nowruz to after the Eid celebration, or can we break our fast and then dance afterwards? And I don't know how people will do it this year. Others will say, well, look, we weren't originally Muslims anyway. They might say, well, we were Zoroastrian. Some might say, and there were plenty of Christians in that region who did sort of bow the knee to Islam. And so it's a huge ideological issue in people's minds when it comes to, Nowruz this year. And in Kurdistan, there's a slight issue with the way that the legend is told originally, in that the liberation, the redemption takes place so that the oppressed people can return to their rightful Persian king. Now, I've never heard a Kurd say, well, we celebrate the folklore of Kawa, the blacksmith, redeeming us from the oppressor so that we could return to our true Persian king, because many Kurds actually don't want to live under Persian, Iranian rule anyway.
Sure.
And so that's interesting to see the way that the folklore has been adapted for a Kurdish context.
Yeah.
Jerry, you said a little bit earlier you'd be quite happy to celebrate Nowruz, but you're not a Zoroastrian.
No.
So what's going on there? What are you thinking?
So, I mean, I haven't said much about it, the fact that it's the spring equinox. Okay, so equinox, it means that the day and the night are of equal length on the 21st of March. Now, the arrival of spring is something that the Bible addresses in Song of Songs. You know, it talks about the time of spring has come, and the cooing of the doves, and it's a love poem. You know, the Song of Songs, but it's celebrating spring as something wonderful, and actually in a Kurdish context, that's very significant, because you have a quite short window of time between, you know, a harsh winter and a pretty brutal summer. So, you know, spring is something to be really enjoyed while it lasts, you know, a bit like the British days at the beach, where just for a few days in the year, it's warm enough to
one afternoon in August, maybe something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm very much, I would say that it's true, the critique that evangelicals are often, you know, strong on their doctrine of redemption and weak on their doctrine of creation. But the cash value of that is, do we actually enjoy God's creation, you know, or do we think that God is some sort of cosmic spoilsport? You know, we can slip into that way of thinking through a right zeal for, you know, the spreading of the good news and the teaching of sound doctrine and things. But actually, you know, I go back to 1 Timothy 6 about, you know, God has created all things for our enjoyment. You know, there's nothing worldly about enjoying the creation that God designed in all its beauty. To be enjoyed. So I want to throw myself wholeheartedly into celebrating with friends, whether they're Muslims or Yazidis or Zoroastrians or whatever. I think, and I do have a bone with the way that the environment is destroyed by people's trash, you know, that they spread all over the countryside. So it's not just enjoying the volleyball and the barbecues and stuff, but actually we should try and protest against people that are leaving trash everywhere. That's another big issue.
Okay. Well, we had a lecturer here, Dan Strange, who was big into subversive fulfillment, if I could throw that phrase at you. And he picked that up, obviously, from others, Hendrik Kramer, J.H. Bavinck, talking about the way that the gospel can kind of grab hold of existing things and give them the lie, but also fulfill them or fulfill their aspirations with true gospel content. Can you see that applying at all to Nowruz, especially thinking about that myth with Zahak and
Kawa,
noble Kawa?
Yeah, well, I think there are amazing kind of striking resemblances between the Nowruz legend and the story of God's redemption in Christ. And so, you know, you could take the whole nature of the world in which we live, where we do live under terrible tyranny at times. You know, it can be the government, you know, the central government. It can be a bad husband. It can be a domineering mother-in-law. It can be a bad boss. Any of those things we experience.
Economic systems, all sorts of things.
All kinds of manipulation and oppression. It is a valley of tears, you know, that we live in so many ways. And if we're not aware with that, we're not going to connect with so many people that we minister to in our neighborhoods. So there is a sort of value in just in mourning over the way the world is, or else we're in cloud cuckoo land. People just think we're not real people, you know. But then, you know, we all long for some sort of hero figure that will set the world right. I mean, you know, think of all the Superman movies, the Marvel movies. They're to a penny, aren't they? But in particular, there's this resemblance of Kawa, the blacksmith, to Jesus the carpenter. You know, it's important to underline that he didn't, you know, wasn't born in a palace. He didn't sort of just float around, never getting his hands dirty. He worked as a carpenter, and then he gave 3 years of his life to itinerant ministry, and he died as a sacrifice. Now, the thing that I haven't mentioned about the Nauros legend is that the way that Kawa redeemed the people under the control of Zahak was that Zahak had to feed the snakes coming from his shoulders with the brains of young people. It's a gruesome story.
Oh my goodness! Okay,
I mean, parents will have to decide whether they want the full detail in the story. I mean, actually, a lot of children's folklore, is actually quite gruesome. The big bad wolf. Yeah, sure.
A snake kind of devouring humanity. This is going to ring bells for Christians, isn't it?
Well, yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's the devil is pictured as a serpent. And so Kawa decided to sacrifice sheep. He actually sacrificed for every 2 people that were being fed to Zahak. He killed 1 sheep and therefore saved one of the 2. Slightly, sad part of the story that not everyone was saved through his act of redemption and liberation like this. But it did mean that once the snakes were fed on the brains, one person could be told, "Look, go out into the countryside," and that's how the Kurds mythologically described. It's actually the manuscript. I haven't yet looked it up. It's apparently in the Bodleian Library in Oxford of the Kurdish telling of this story from the I think the 1600s, maybe the late 16th century. And in the Kurdish form of the legend, the people who were thus redeemed by this substitution then went to go off and live in the wild and develop their own civilization and develop their own language. It's a very interesting description, which, again, is it historical? What date did this really happen? Those sort of questions we might have. No, I mean, it's a telling of a story which is folkloric, but yet it does ring true because they've lived as this very separate people in the Zagros Mountains and have developed a language that is, it's certainly very different from Arabic and Turkish, but it's different even from Persian, from which it comes. So that's sort of how the Kurds see themselves, going back to Sharaf Nama Bitlisi and his legend, which I've got to find somewhere, the manuscript in the Bodleian. That's so I see Jesus as the sort of true Kawa, and he's come to destroy the devil's works. 1 John says that, doesn't it? And so I see Jesus as he's signposted by this folklore, not in the same way that Jewish scripture specifically prophesies the coming of Jesus, but I would say signposted, because often the myths of the world bear this striking resemblance to the true redemption story. Yeah.
So there's that longing there for a redeemer, and in some senses you want to say to your Kurdish friends, Jesus is the redeemer you've always been waiting for,
exactly.
you've always aspired to.
And there is another point that's quite kind of close to the bone, is that one Kurd said to me, our problem is that Kawa has become Zahak. So you think of, any country where someone comes in saying, away with the old, with the new.
So Kawa has become
Zahak, meaning the so-called liberators have become the oppressors.
Right.
So often, the people who come in and say, look, we're making all things new, and, we're new system, and now we've got self-rule, and we've done away with Europe, let's say, to put a slightly, to bring it home to Britain today. Well, actually, often these people end up, you think, well, they're no better than the previous guy,
putting your hope in apparent earthly liberators that will in the end disappoint.
Exactly. Yeah.
Every people group on earth has learned that. See that come. So, just in talking with Kurdish friends, both in Kurdistan and here, have you found there's been kind of, the conversations have been fruitful when you've been able to say, do you know, I have a similar story? Or something like that.
I've not done it enough to know, to see that many people's reaction to it. But I have flagged it up, and I'd like to write more just to really spell it out, and explain more about how Jesus by his blood has stepped in to our place, taking the punishment we deserved so that we can go free. And it takes time to spell it out for people.
Of course.
On your recommendation, Jerry, I had a Kurdish barber, and when you sat in the chair, you got lots of time to talk.
Yeah.
His English was up to it, so we talked about it, and asked him a little bit about it, and talked a little bit about maybe Jesus is the kawa that you've been waiting for, and people just are fascinated to know that you know a little bit of their history. And I was just wondering, we've got lots of Kurdish people living in our communities around our churches. We perhaps don't really know how to engage. Do you think Nowruz is a good time of year? Could we host a party in our buildings, or would that be outrageous? Or should we go along to people's existing parties? How can we begin to share the gospel story with our friends here in the UK who've come from that region?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that thousands, millions of people are facing at the moment around the world in this kind of, world of mass migration is they end up in a new place and they feel friendless. And Kurds actually give their children some curious names like Bekes, meaning without a person, like friendless. And, they like to express their angst and grief in the names they even give to their children. And so it's a very real part of their experience is, they say no friends but the mountains. Havol Nina Jibuli Chioyan. That's just a very common descriptor the Kurds use of themselves. But I pray, and I'm sure this is happening in many places, that Kurds are finding a warm welcome from followers of Jesus in their local communities who do, they don't know maybe that much about, Kurdish culture, but perhaps they know the difference between Kurdistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, which must be a familiar frustration for Kurds. And just receiving a welcome, or someone in the barber's chair to say, I've heard a bit about Nowruz, your new year, and this amazing story about the black. You don't need to remember everything, but just a little bit of the basic plot line, and they'll just be so pleased that you know something about their history. And it's quite soul destroying in a way to be in a place where people they might treat you as sort of being a foreigner, and then if they think you're just an Arab or a Turk or a sort of a Muslim in the sense that as if that summarized who you were. I mean, people just must feel so frustrated by that kind of reception from people who are not maybe actively racist but are not very warm-hearted.
Yeah, I mean. Many people of the UK, I mean, if you're Scottish, and you go, let's say, to the United States, and they just talk about you like you're English. I've got plenty of Scottish friends. It winds them up, and
I'm sure.
It's a similar kind of thing. But coming back, you both mentioned Kurdish barbers.
Yeah.
Just give us a sense of, roughly the numbers of Kurdish people now in the UK, where they've tended to settle, the kinds of occupations they found. Yeah. Just give us that kind of orientation.
I mean, the ballpark figure of sort of 300,000 Kurds in the UK might be about right. In the late 80s...
I mean, that's a decent-sized city, isn't it? That's a large number of people.
Yeah, it's a significant population. And then a lot of those are young men who will likely bring a bride over from Kurdistan and then have children. So that population could increase significantly in coming years. But in the late 80s, a lot of people from central eastern Anatolia, Alevi Kurds, came over and settled in the Haringey, Enfield kind of area.
So, Anatolia, so we're talking Turkey kind of area. Yeah.
So Turkish Kurds. And then the Home Office sort of moved away from that model of almost sort of ghettoized communities into more of a dispersal scheme. But actually that happens anyway in terms of Kurds who learn the trade of barbering and then want to go to a market town, sort of friendly face, engaging people. That's the sort of feedback people give. Kurdish people, they're a friendly lot, and so they're going to make good barbers. And so that's the way to make a decent living, is finding a market town that doesn't have a traditional Turkish barber, and you set up shop there. So that's what we're seeing around the UK.
So if I see a sign above a shop that says Turkish barber, which increasingly I do, is it quite likely that it's a Kurd?
Yeah, it's most likely an Iraqi Kurd working there. Yeah.
Yeah, you thought quite a lot about the shop, the high street, as a communal area. We Westerners, we go to the high street. Usually, we go to do a transaction, get something, especially us males, we're in and out fairly quickly.
Yeah.
But for Kurdish people and people from that broader region, there's more of a sense of community extension into the shop area, whether it be a barber's or a grocer's or perhaps even a kebab shop or something, a Kurdish restaurant, something like that.
Yeah.
And the women tend to be more communal around the home, if I got this right, and the men
generally
tend to be more communal around the high street shops. Could you say a little bit about that and how that might present opportunities for British Christians to wander down their high street and hang out?
Actually, I just in a small way, I've noticed this in the small area here.
Yeah.
The local barbers I go to, I don't think that it's not run by Kurdish people.
Yeah.
But I just kind of person I am by background. I go in, I get my haircut, I chat to the barber, I go away.
Yeah.
And I never think of going unless I need my haircut again. Yeah. But there are regularly people dropping in, and I'm looking at you going, you look like you had a haircut last week.
Yeah, sure.
And
they've dropped into tea.
They've dropped into chat. They've just dropped into chat.
Yeah.
It's clearly a very different culture to mine.
Yeah. So, I wrote an article called, what was it?
I think shop and restaurant
engaging
community.
with shop and restaurant communities. And I intended that to be that normally we don't, it's a, what's the word, oxymoron, that normally shop and community don't go together. A shop is somewhere where you go in for a quick exchange of goods, and that's different from a community. But you often find, the shops are just an outflow of a community with perhaps an extended family working there and people from a similar background. And it's often a place where children are kind of apprenticed in real life, to learn how to serve customers and represent their country in some sense. It's soft skills, obviously, that you're teaching in many cases. But and so I think that if you really want to reach people with the good news of Jesus, then it can be a good thing to go back to the same shops and get to know people, show an interest in them and their culture, their how their kids are doing at school, those sort of things, and bit by bit show yourself to be more interested in them than your average customer who just comes in for the pint of milk.
Yeah. What kind of, to engage with that, both when you were living in Kurdish areas and now you're back here, what kind of, because it's not natural in my culture, I guess, nor in your original culture. What kind of mind shifts or heart shifts did you have to kind of deliberately work through in order really to engage with that?
Let me give you one problem, is that we in the West, we have quite a sort of social hierarchy based on, graduate jobs with doctors and engineers and barristers at the top of, all that sort of snobbery. And so therefore you kind of think, well, maybe the shopkeeper is not sort of terribly intellectual. You wouldn't ever say that, but you can often think that.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, I've had some incredibly intellectual conversations, with philosophical falafel makers, let's say, and maybe they have more time to think and listen to, YouTube and stuff because they're doing a manual job than someone who's just so busy doing accountancy that he doesn't have much time to think about, the big issues and current affairs,
And if I'm going into a shop thinking, okay, I've heard this, it's a local shop, I know it's run by Kurdish people, praying, it'd be lovely if there's a conversation. Because of who I am, the voice I've got in my head is, what they really want you to do is make your purchase, pay your money and leave, otherwise you're getting in their way. Just paint more of a picture from the Kurdish shop owner's point of view.
Yeah.
What's their view of the customers who come in and the kind of interactions that they would love to have?
Good question.
Let's say with someone like me walking into their shop.
There are sort of some various practical issues there. That there's rush hour and there's non-rush hour in shops. If you can, and some pastors do have time mid-morning, where they can go into a shop and expect a cup of tea. Not demand a cup of tea, but they'll likely have time, for a more extended conversation, which is just not appropriate when all the kids are coming out of school. Let's say, so there's practical issues like that. I think people can be bored by the routine of another packet of cigarettes and another pint of milk, but. So they're happy to talk, But I always go back to that sense that God has given us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and even those of us who are thinking, okay, I want to serve the gospel but we're still acting with the kind of one ear, two mouths sort of paradigm where we just want to talk because we think, hey, now I understand their worldview and I want to sort of speak into it. No, you can find that people can be from, they might have very different, depending on how seriously they take their religion that they were brought up with, and then are they on the left or the right of the political spectrum, and what do they think of Turkey now with the big shift in a more Islamic direction? Do they welcome that, or do they think that's awful and that's why they're in Britain? Any of those things are just good questions to ask. How do you find Turkey today? Are you pleased with the way things are developing? And that then allows you to gauge where people are at, or just look behind the counter and see, are they selling booze? Because you might think, well, if they're a Muslim, why would they be selling alcohol? And often, especially in North London, it's because they're Alevis, and there is no prohibition against drinking alcohol. Alevis. So they're kind of technically Shiites, but not like extreme Shiites that you see in Iran. But they're more humanist, a little bit like the Quakers in Christian history, dissented from the mainstream, and often they would see themselves as very much humanists. And you can get into some very interesting conversations with the ways in which they feel they've been oppressed by the majority religion.
Yeah. Well, let's say you knock up some friendships like this. You spend some time with people, and there's some receptivity. Yeah. People become Christians.
Yeah.
Let's say they've got Islamic names, for example. Okay. You've written recently an article called "Dear Pastor Muhammad, isn't it about time you changed your name?" or something like that, which hopefully will roll out as a blog. What's your take on that? Is it better for them to have their name changed, like Saul had his name changed to Paul? What do you think, Jerry?
So I think read the article. I think there can be a great mistake in thinking, someone who's become a follower of Jesus and they're called Muhammad, really they should have their name changed. And the thing is that often, especially from Iraq, if you're called Muhammad, it's often because your grandfather was called Muhammad. And so it's perfectly possible to say, I like being called Muhammad. It reminds me of my grandfather. Okay, he wasn't a follower of Jesus, but he taught me lots about, keeping bees and, how to prune an apple tree, and so it goes back to the fifth commandment: honor your father and your mother. That when people come to faith in Jesus, we don't expect them to be cut off from their family or to make a mess of their sandwich shop because suddenly you're insisting they change their name. Everyone knows him as Hammer or Mohammed or something, So I think that and even the name Muhammad, actually, if you look at it, it actually has a very good meaning of, praiseworthy. And so
that's the meaning of the name Muhammad, is it?
Yeah, I think so.
Praiseworthy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there might be reasons people take on an additional name, and that can be something very constructive. In Kurdish there are some wonderful names that are very common, like Shavan, meaning shepherd. Have you thought of any shepherds that you admire, Tim?
Yeah.
There's that guy from Palestine.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, he was, or Rezvan, meaning vine dresser, or even the name of the New Testament in Kurdish is Mezgini, and Mezgin is a common name meaning, good news. Mezgini, it means good news, and so it's wonderful that there are names like that that can be used as very Kurdish names, and go for many other cultures around the world, that you can take things from the existing culture and breathe, real Christian intentionality into them.
Okay. And of course, we're not the only people to think missiologically about what to do when people from other backgrounds, from other religious backgrounds, become Christians.
Yeah.
You dug up something that William Carey had written in 1805, tackling this very issue, didn't you? The Serampore Agreement.
Covenant, these were the early days where these guys were serving the gospel in Bengal, and it's a short document, actually, that they don't cover things exhaustively about the practice of mission. But one of the things they do put their finger on is we don't force new names on converts. And then they say, well, that's because the apostles didn't insist on new names for what was the list? Phoebe was one of them.
Phoebe, my daughter's called Phoebe.
Oh, and I liked Epaphroditus. This article you've written, which as they said, we will put out as a blog on the college website in a week or two. Epaphroditus. It had never occurred to me till I read your article. It means from Aphrodite.
Exactly.
And they happily live with him as a Christian.
Yeah.
Yes. So your daughter's pagan name in the clear.
Yes. Well, I didn't know it when I called her it, but now having heard you, Jerry, I think I still would have called her Phoebe. So there we go. So let's not put pressure on people from Muslim backgrounds to change their Islamic names. But allow them to keep them, because there might be a whole range of reasons, plus New Testament precedent for keeping them.
And it's also just to do with focusing on the real change that is important. It's not about the change of clothing.
Right.
Sadly, some converts in parts of the world just end up dressing like Westerners, and that's just a terrible departure from the culture that there's nothing wrong with that way of dressing in a distinctly African or Chinese or Brazilian way. So the same with names, is that we want our name in biblical terms is our character, and it's we want to shine a new character that is full of kindness, compassion, humility. That's the name change that really counts.
On names, Jeremy, there was a very famous American man that lived in Kurdistan called Roger Cumberland.
Yes.
Could you tell us about Roger Cumberland, please?
Yeah, so on June the 12th, 1938, Roger Cumberland had lived for 12 years, 15 years in total. He lived there among the Kurds, and he was shot dead in his own home because people had been coming to... It's still debated as to why he was killed, but undoubtedly part of it was that Muslims had been becoming followers of Jesus. And there was a lot of pushback and consternation that Kurds were going to turn to Christ en masse, really. And so he was shot dead. And but yet his legend has sort of lived on. And my concern has been that his house, which is slightly dilapidated, still remains in the center of Tehuk, where we lived.
And you can visit it as a tourist attraction.
Well, they're trying to restore it,
right?
So that it will be a museum. And his daughter, before she died last year, said, "I want it to be a centre for peace and reconciliation." And the local authorities are honouring that and are seeking to restore it as a sort of period piece house. And people are just fascinated by a man who came in. He didn't learn Arabic, but he was fluent in Kurdish, and he earned the respect of the people. And I've done a webinar about him and have been interviewed for a documentary film about him. So I'm looking forward to his story it's a brilliant, amazing story. And I'm looking to still editing his letters and looking to make his story better known.
When you say you've been interviewed for a documentary, is that on Kurdish TV or
It's
BBC?
done by a Kurdish filmmaker. We'll see what gets put out, but even the short videos that have been made about him, even the ones that are slightly critical of him, 147,000 people viewing it on Facebook, just huge interest in his life, and they don't know the half of what a colourful and adventurous character he was.
Jeremy, thank you so much for coming down to be with us for this podcast. I think this kind of thing just. Because I'm not the missiologist around here, you are, but it just opens my eyes to the kind of world perspective we all ought to have, and just the sheer numbers. I mean, you said 300,000 Kurdish people set up home in this country. Many will bring over a wife. They'll have a family. They'll put down roots here. This is a large number of people amongst us. What would you, for someone listening into this? Who's a resident of the UK or any area where there are Kurdish people as neighbours, what would you want them to kind of take on board as an insight or a truth to lodge in their hearts?
One of the things, Tim, is that we tend to read our Bible through the lens of American and European, perhaps Australian theologians. Now, all of these places are thousands of miles away from the biblical action. Now, the way that God's Spirit is moving is that many more people from the Bible lands, if you like, are coming to faith in Christ and are studying their Bibles afresh. And they do take note of, let's say, the Queen of Sheba. She came from Yemen, right?
And is that happening among Kurds as well?
Yeah.
We know about Iranians, but as well?
Kurds there are much smaller numbers, but increasing numbers of Syrian Kurds particularly coming to faith. But what I'm saying here is that as Western Christians, we've got to get back to seeing that. I know, Dave, you've told me about how Ethiopians, they know Psalm 68, I think.
That's right.
And you know, I mean, there are promises for, you know, people, you know, from Iraq. People used to talk about how, you know, Assyria and Egypt are mentioned in Isaiah 19. There was one conference where there were Egyptians and then Assyrian Christians, and they were just very fascinated by this promise that, you know, us Brits are just, if we get a mention at all, we're the far off distant coastlands, the far off islands, and that's where we get a mention in Isaiah, you know. So I think that's part of it is to realize that there are, you know, there is a particular way that God addresses those who are from, you know, the Middle East and those nations around the Table of Nations, for example. You know, you can find many modern nations to some extent there addressed in Genesis 10.
So just sitting down where possible, reading the Bible with these folks who, in a sense, see themselves more directly in it than I might do.
Yeah, and just being ready. Look, another example. You know, Ruth was a Jordanian. You know, oh really? Well, she was a Moabite. Yeah, I suppose she was. You know, but it's just we don't think that way, and yet that's not to say that, you know, that makes the Jordanians any more important or the Kurds any more important. That's a fallacy. But actually, the fact that you know, the Medes were there at the day of Pentecost, together with the Parthians and the Elamites, which is Iran, you know, and residents of Mesopotamia, which is Iraq. You know, like the Brits clearly weren't there, but these nations were. And I think we should cherish those things and show how relevant the Bible is, lest they think, this is a man with his American religion,
with his Western religion,
which is just so wrong-headed, you know.
Thank you. That's a wonderful insight. A very helpful one to end on. It's been great to have a former student of Christ here on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming down. Every blessing to you in your ongoing work and ministry.
Thank you.
We trust that this episode of Deep Roots has been a real blessing to you. We'll be posting the next one in a month's time. See you then.